what I'm going to try to do with this next panel session is to allow it to flow from the previous session, where we had a very good discussion about what would happen post-Brexit, referring to the UK industrial strategy that was published by the government in March, the Green Paper. We talked about some of the things that might hold back economic growth, the importance of productivity, and the whole theme of regional development started to come out. And I'm sat here today very much as the chairman of the Midlands Engine, which is one of the key regions of the UK. It's one of the largest economic units outside of London, and it has a population of around 12 million people. So whatever we do from an industrial strategy point of view, we have to get it right for the Midlands region because of its strategic importance to the country, its size and its location. But one of the key drivers of any success that's achieved in the UK, but particularly in the Midlands, will be the businesses that are based there. And we have on the panel today, I have with me, 3 senior business leaders from 3 global businesses in the advanced manufacturing sector. And that came up, that was referred to several times in the previous session. On my far left, I have Des McKeon, who is the Commercial Director of Bombardier Transportation here in the UK. And as I'm sure are all aware, Bombardier have a very important role to play as the government invests in new infrastructure, in rail particularly, and it's going to be interesting to hear Des's views on some of the things that government will need to do post-Brexit. Sat next to Des, we have Philippe Bouveret, who I know is known to many of you here, and Philippe is a director of JCB, which in many ways is an iconic British brand today. It certainly is with my grandkids. I can tell you I have a grandson who loves his JCB digger, and he swears by it. But Philippe has got amazing international experience and has been working very closely with government departments recently about ways in which we can perhaps accelerate growth, invest in a sector which could be important not just here in the UK, but also internationally, and that's infrastructure. Wherever I've traveled in the world over the last few years, investment in infrastructure is top of the agenda. And on my immediate left, I have Paul Harris, who is Director of Economic Development at Rolls-Royce PLC. And Paul has been very involved with the work we've been doing on the Midlands Engine, and I hope what he's going to be able to bring out and put across in this afternoon's session is address some of the issues that came out earlier today on what Rolls-Royce will need post-Brexit to drive its success into the future. So let me begin with a question for you, Des, if I may. You heard in that last session about some of the issues which we think government should be mindful of in terms of productivity and driving economic growth. But from the point of view of the advanced manufacturing sector, and Bombardier in particular, you've had some tremendous success in recent months and years. Perhaps you could begin by just addressing that. What will government do? What do you want government to do post-Brexit?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think the first point I'd like to make is that the current environment for rail in the UK is actually making it in great shape, and that's been quite a change. You mentioned the great East Anglia win, £1 billion worth of next generation Aventa trains for East Anglia. That, of course, followed key recent orders for Crossrail and West Anglia with Transport for London. So you know, we are building our order book strongly now, which, if people remember, is in stark contrast to 5-6 years ago when we were unsuccessful on Thameslink, and it went ballistic in the press, not at our instigation, by the way. If I may, just a bit of background info. We have a factory in Derby, as John mentioned. We have 3,500 people there and across the UK, and we support 15,000 other jobs in the local supply chain. We probably the only UK supplier with the ability to design, build and test an entire train, which of course links to export, which I'll come on to. But it really is, we believe, a flagship asset for the Midlands and for the UK with that export potential.
And Des,
yes.
tell me, is Britain as competitive in the sector that you're in as other companies in markets outside of the UK?
So you mean, is, for example, Siemens as competitive in Germany as Bombardier is in the UK?
Absolutely.
It's hard to say. I would one of the areas I was going to talk about was that of the 10 pillars that the government have set out in the industrial strategy, one of the key ones is improving procurement. We've maybe been too strict in adopting the EU procurement rules. Thameslink was a great example where the contracts let there to save some money, value for money, fine. But over there, you know, other socio-economic factors maybe weren't taken into account. But, you know, Siemens tends to win contracts in Germany. Alstom tend to win contracts in France. Recently, Bombardier didn't tend to win contracts in the UK. So we've taken a lot of steps over the last few years to make sure that we are winning competitions absolutely outright. You know, we're not looking for any favours from anybody. We just want a level playing field, and if there is a real requirement for UK content, let's see it in franchise specifications. You know, government talk about it, but you can never see it in writing. It's never evaluated.
Thank you, Des. Philip, if I could turn to you now, and you know, you and I have done enough overseas trade missions to know that there is life outside of the EU. There is great opportunity in some of these growth markets. But I made a comment a few moments ago about infrastructure. There was once a time when Britain built the world. It was seen in railways, on roads, or where have you. What do you think government could do to support Britain's ability to invest internationally, globally, on infrastructure projects? And I know you've been working with government on a thing called the IELF, the Infrastructure Export Leadership Forum. I wonder if you could maybe share a bit about that with us too.
Yes, catchy phrase, isn't it? We need to take a fresh approach to selling infrastructure overseas. It was briefly mentioned in the industrial strategy, and it was called a Team UK approach, and the IELF acronym came from that. Industry, when I say industry, I mean the whole infrastructure piece. That's from consultants through to manufacturing, designers, builders, architects, financiers, etc. They've told government that we need to work differently, and the Department of International Trade has listened. It's clear that the UK is not well positioned today to respond to the big changes taking place internationally in the infrastructure market. And I think we all agree with that. So what are we going to do about it? Our customer base is increasingly asking for project solutions. When we travel, people want, you know, can Britain build this railway? Well, no, we can't at the moment because we don't get together and do it. So winning these projects requires a collaboration of different types of companies across sectors to present a single face and a single offer. UK companies rarely join forces in this way. We watch our competitor countries, and we've watched them for years, sweep in at early stages and take ownership. You know, Korea, China, Japan, USA, France, Germany have constantly taken early stage positions, and we've seen the headlines this creates. The Japanese corridor or the German port, or you know, We don't do this. So, yeah, the fund flows are shifting around the world into new frontier markets. So we have to prepare ourselves to hit some of these. We can't wait for formal tenders to start to appear. You know, that's a ridiculous situation, because then you're just also running with everybody else. The UK needs to engage in an early startup to shape the opportunities. So, sorry, when I say startup, I mean engage at an early stage to shape the opportunities. The opportunities must be created, and UK PLC must take ownership and take the lead, not follow. So, bearing this in mind, the clear offer had to be beaten out with the Department of International Trade. And we've been working with Liam Fox and Greg Hans. Greg Hans is the chair of ILF, and the co-chair of ILF is an industry leader who is actually a builder, who knows a bit about putting things together. I can't mention his name right now because we're in something called PERDA, but it will be mentioned in due course. We're involved with first-class infrastructure projects around the world, but normally as consultants. We haven't yet defined our complete infrastructure offer in a way that can be presented to overseas buyers. We need to understand and plug the gaps in our supply chains, and where they're opportune, we can join forces with foreign partners, we can target FDI, we can invest in an export strategy. It just doesn't mean to be all us, but we need to actually hold the reins. The ILF Forum has a mechanism to disseminate. It coordinates with the 25 trade bodies, with its 14,000 odd members. It's open to all. Anybody can access, anybody can join in the opportunity. This is a new way of actually putting the opportunity out there. The basic objectives, I'll just go through very quickly. It's a collaborative high approach to high-value campaigns, in some cases with posts applying for the allocation of prosperity funding to scope studies and planting that all-important early UK PLC DNA, such as British standards in the way that we go about the early engagement. Pre-competitive market engagement is what it's about, and it's not about trying to cover everything. It's picking them off. It's looking really carefully at what the right thing is. Yeah. And we have to demonstrate our capability. The forum will work closely with overseas posts and assist in the education of staff on the ground there of how to create and identify these opportunities using what we call infrastructure speak. These are civil servants that we've got to now openly ask to actually start talking our language. As I said, the forum is chaired by a minister and co-chaired by an industry leader, and will also have representatives from the Department for International Development, UK Export Finance, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office sitting around the table on a regular basis. That's it. And I was hoping that one of our ministers was here today to say what I've just said.
Well, you said it very well, Philip, and I think, again, it's a great example of where business, working with government, hand in glove with government, can actually drive forward initiatives like that. And I congratulate on the work you've done, particularly in bringing that forward. But, Paul, perhaps Philip's reference to supply chain, I could use that as a segue to say to you, again, it would be very good to get your perspective, Rolls-Royce's perspective on a post-Brexit Britain and what you'd like government to do. But this issue of supply chains, working with supply chain organizations to try to tackle some of the issues which they face to make the whole thing more seamless, and indeed some of the barriers we talked about in the last section around skills and productivity. I wonder if you could similarly pick up on that.
Sure, thanks. I think I'd start from saying that as Rolls-Royce, we're really pleased that the government is interested in industrial strategy again, that it's not a persona non grata kind of a word anymore. And we're also pleased to see that there is a focus in there on sector deals and sector understanding. And the reason that we think that's so important is because a good sectoral strategy actually brings global competitive forces into our national thinking. and actually sets out the challenge that the world is setting to UK companies that want to compete on a global stage. Because unless we can compete at that level, then you can do all the trade deals that you like. If you're not competitive, you're not going to win. So for us, a real focus on competitiveness, and perhaps picking up on something that was talked about earlier. Yeah, people sort of talk about productivity, and it can sound like a bit of a technical word. But competitiveness can actually really mobilize people, and people understand what that means. So for me, on the industrial strategy, I would say a focus on how can the industrial strategy, which needs to be a coherent whole government strategy, not just something that is owned in the business department. It has to pull education through, it has to pull through defence, it has to pull through procurement. So it's good that you've got lots of different pillars in there, but actually if it results in this pillar going to that department and this pillar going to that department, actually we've lost the point of it. It needs to be something that's really coherent. And the UK and the Midlands in particular, has got some great global companies, there's three sitting here, that compete in global markets. We compete against extremely well-funded, well-run, really hungry competitors. And we can bring that competitive perspective into the UK and into the supply chains that we lead in the UK. And I think a part of the industrial strategy needs to recognise that it's not about a top level, are there any overall levers we may be able to pull that will nudge productivity by 1% here or there. In some cases, supply chains need to be improved by 10, 15, 20% if they're going to survive in the UK. So it's what's appropriate for a given industry. Use the large companies that are competing on the global stage to help to set the agenda, and then make the support that we provide to businesses coherent by having an industrial strategy that pulls through the skills agenda, that pulls through encouragement for companies to invest in research and development, that pulls through capital investment and particularly investment in digital technologies that can really transform a business. That when you bring those things together, that's actually what drives firm level productivity. That's what drives firm level competitiveness. And if the industrial strategy is for anything, it surely has to be for allowing companies to firstly appreciate the size of the challenge and the opportunity that they have on a global market, and then to provide them with the help that they need to step up to that and to grasp those opportunities. So I think that's sort of my perspective on it. So my plea, I guess, for industrial strategy is coherence. Make it a whole of government strategy. Make it coherent with Brexit. We were hearing earlier today about the first pillar of the trade agenda being unilateral reduction of tariffs. So there will be industries where, unless you support those companies in that industry to become more competitive, if there are tariffs that have been protecting them, actually you're going to get a very sharp hit very quickly. Many of those companies could be capable of stepping up, but haven't been in that environment before. So helping companies to make those transitions is really key. So a plea for coherence and a plea for we shouldn't be shy of global competitive forces, but let's be coherent in the way that we rise to them and the way that we support businesses in responding to them.
Thank you, Paul. So there you have it. You've heard from three very successful businesses, globally successful, based in the Midlands. And I think what comes across is, and I get this from all the businesses I talk to, not just in the Midlands, but around the country right now, but a sense of give us a roadmap and we'll get on with it and make it happen. And more than anything right now, that's the message I get. And what we're going to be doing with the Midlands Engine, and these three individuals and organisations are very much at the heart of this, is we are going to respond to the government over the coming months with our own view of what a strategy for the Midlands in particular might look like, addressing the 9 or 10 pillars contained in the government's paper. My biggest fear about any strategy, taken for granted it's a good strategy, it's the execution. And it's so important, therefore, that we don't just have from government a plan, a strategy, a document in its own right, but also a plan and a clear intent to execute on that strategy and make it a success. So what I'd like to do now, if I may, I'd like to open it up to questions. We have time for just one or two questions, and perhaps if you want to put those questions to members of the panel, please feel free to do so. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Roger Kendrick, I'm an investor in small businesses. There are two things we haven't talked about today. One is import substitution. There's been a lot of stuff about free trade agreements and exporting all over the world and all the rest of it, but we import about 90 billion more from Europe than we export. And it seems to me there's an immediate opportunity there for all British companies to start selling to the customers in the UK who buy from abroad. And that is just not on the agenda. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing is, in the earlier session we talked about productivity, but nobody mentioned regulation. And the facts of the matter are that when you introduce regulation, you have people in organisations carrying out the rules and regulations and scrutinising them and enforcing them. If you go back 10 years, you didn't have regulators or looking in estate agents, for instance. My son worked for a bank where the compliance department has gone up from 1% to 10% of the staff. It's obvious why our productivity is falling, because we are surrounded by regulation. Now, of course, there may be some benefit, but I think it's just a major factor which nobody wants to talk about.
I can pick up on the import
Paul, yes, go
substitution.
ahead.
So certainly I'd agree that import substitution is an opportunity as long as UK companies can beat their global competitors in winning the business. And I think where I'm coming from is that the performance gap, I'm not even going to talk about productivity, the competitiveness gap in an industry like aerospace, where actually a global purchasing approach can make sense. You've got relatively small, light parts, the cost of logistics isn't high. You have got firms that are much more competitive in other parts of the world. So what does it take for our UK companies to be able to beat that? And for me, it's not shaving a few percentages off here and there. It's actually taking advantage of digital technology. It's taking advantage of upskilling the workforce and actually innovating. That's how UK companies really compete. So whether it's a like-for-like, piece part for piece part, but certainly increasing UK content in our products, for example, is possible if the UK supply chain is able to step up and be competitive in doing that. And we think the government can and should play a role in helping those companies to do that. They can't do it exclusively, but they can help. Yeah.
Des, from a regulation point of view, do you have a view on that? And is that a problem for you as you...
I wouldn't say it's a problem. As long as the regulations are clear and everybody's got the same set of regulations, then, you know, as I said at the start, it's having that knowledge of what's out there and being, you know, firm about it, and it's not being shaken, not moving all over the place. So in rail, there's the TSI, Technical Standards for Interfacing. The big question we're asking government is, what are you going to adopt, you know, post-Brexit? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be less or higher? Hopefully not higher. So that's really where we're focusing. On the first point, if I may, on the supply chain, so we're at 74% content of our trains are British supply. The 26% really comes from, we have an industrial strategy that says there are global centres of excellence. For example, the bogies are made from Germany, which we just decided to put all of the bogies in one country. That's not to say that for future things, for example, HS2, we might build bogies in the UK. And then the only other areas really are things like aluminium, which you just cannot buy to the lengths that we require it from the UK. There just isn't a market.
Philip, do you want to comment at all on points that have been made?
I'd just like to add that it's becoming increasingly more difficult for our company to buy steel products and castings, particularly in the United Kingdom. We don't make castings anymore. I think the largest casting you can get in the UK is about a square foot. But in our industry, we need to cast large axles and gearboxes, which some of them are 2-3 meters long. So I'm afraid we can't buy in the UK. We'd love to see investment coming back in, but I don't think it will sustain it. So we are hung on bringing those exports in, some from Europe, but increasingly we're seeing from outside Europe components come in, particularly Turkey.
Now we have just one final question, sir. It's yours, and it better be a good question.
No pressure.
Hopefully I won't disappoint. It's Philip Rush from Petronomics. So over the past 18 months, we've obviously had sizable depreciation of sterling. And at least if we believe the official data, it seems that export prices to foreign companies haven't really moved, which would imply a large increase in profit margins. From your perspective, are you actually experiencing a large expansion in profit margins that might be encouraging future investment? Or have you seen a sterling price cheapening that could perhaps lead to an increase in demand from foreigners? Basically, then choosing to buy Britain because it's a lot cheaper than it was 18 months ago.
Philip, do you want to just kick off this time?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long answer, and there's lots of graphs that will show you that you're wrong. But I just would like to say one thing very easily, in that we supply an enormous amount of finished product to the house building market, which is actually booming at the moment. And you'll see on building sites these yellow machines that lift pallets up and down. What we've seen is an increase in our business substantially in the last 6 months, because due to the level of sterling, our European friends and friends further afield have been swamping the auction houses in this country and buying everything they can and taking it out of the country. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. Probably not.
Paul, so were you in the auction houses at all?
No. Ours is a bit of a long answer as well. But so we have a massive hedge book, and we took the headache of that in our latest results with a mark-to-market write-down of several hundred million. So our income, is hedged. Quite a lot of our raw materials are sourced from outside the UK. So what we're actually seeing is for the value-added part, the exchange rate helps a little. But for the raw materials, obviously, that pushes the pound cost of those up. So it's mitigated. The top level benefit that you'd expect is mitigated by a number of areas. And what we found with many of our UK supply chain is that the weaker pound has helped to some extent to close the productivity and competitiveness gap between those guys and some of the other companies in just fundamentally lower cost countries around the world who are adopting new processes with more modern manufacturing equipment. So it's sort of reduced the competitiveness gap, but you shouldn't use that as an excuse. Don't rely on the strength or weakness of your currency for your competitiveness. You've got to look at your business and improve.
Des?
Yeah, that's an easy one on the export side, because at the moment we're not exporting anything. We're, as I said at the start, we're really building up the UK order book and scale so that we can then look to export. But one benefit has been that our competitors largely have euro-based cost base. So things have got a bit more expensive for them. So in terms of competitiveness, it's helped short term, as we said. But no more profit, sadly.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your questions. And can I just say thank you to my panelists for giving some excellent answers to the questions I posed and indeed that you posed. Thank you. Thank you so much.